Good morning. I'm Bob Murphy. I'll be your instructor for the second half of Introduction to Computational Biology, which corresponds to the second half mini Introduction to Computational Cell Biology. I'm unfortunately not able to be with you today and Wednesday because I'm giving a talk at a meeting in Germany, but I will be calling in via Skype to the classroom. If that goes well, then I can answer questions from you during lecture. If that fails, this recording at least will let you be able to get the material that we need to cover in today's and on Wednesday's lecture. I'll be back on Friday, and then any longer questions we can probably address then. So to begin, what this second half of the course is about the combination of building biological models and using biological image analysis, primarily in the context of how we analyze the behaviors of cells. Many of the methods are also applicable for other techniques, but we're going to focus primarily on ways in which they're applicable to analyzing cell behavior. Here, just for reference, are the sources of the readings that I'll be assigning for you. The readings are going to be available on Blackboard. You should have already taken a look and seen the first two readings, and hopefully you've read those. Those cover the material we're going to talk about today. So, the first thing we want to start with is really an overview, and I think this is a reasonably accurate quote from one of the readings. Why do we want to build models? Well, the way to look at it, I think, is that the process of doing science is really about iteratively building models, iteratively improving our models, and the models themselves are the outcome, the output of the process of doing science. And so that the techniques we're going to talk about are ways in which we can try to convert experiments, measurements, into cohesive models that tell us how some biological system works. So, in that context, why do we do modeling of biological systems? Well, what can we achieve by that? One of the things we can do is to take a complex biological system and use a model to reduce the complexity of that system, to be able to have some outputs from the model that help us to understand what's going on inside of it. And the things we're going to start doing today are going to be an example of that. On the other side, what the models enable us to do is to study systems that are too complex for us to be able to capture in our own heads. That is, systems that have too many parts, too many equations, too many variables, for us to be able to really comprehend how the system is working. And what the last 30 years or so of biology has taught us is that biological systems are way more complex than had been thought when I was a graduate student. And we really need to have models to handle that complexity. Now, an equally important thing is that we build models in order to be able to make predictions from the model about things that we haven't measured. And that can be important for a variety of purposes, where we may not be able to measure or may not be able to measure immediately something that we're interested in knowing the answer to, such as the example given here. Some new flu strain appears, and we've managed, let's say this is a few years from now, we've managed to build a good model of the relationship between the flu sequence and its responsiveness to different drugs. And so we might be able to build a model that would predict what drug would work effectively against some new strain of flu. All right? And so that's an important aspect, the idea of being able to predict things we haven't measured. But another equally important aspect is to be able to use a model to tell us what experiments would be good to do, what things would be good to do next. So, for example, to make a prediction, and then to test whether or not that prediction is borne out, especially if we have the luxury of doing that, where maybe perhaps unlike the case where a flu outbreak is happening, we have to decide quickly. Maybe we're in a situation where we have the ability to do experiments more easily. But by the same token, one of the very important things that we can do if we have a model is to use the model to tell us not just predictions, but to tell us which experiments would be the best to do next in order to improve the model. And that is not always the same thing as being able to say what experiments do we have a high confidence that we can make a prediction from. So this is a technique that's called active machine learning. So the idea is that whatever model it is that you have, you use the model to tell you what experiments would be done, you should do next that would optimally improve that model. Okay, so we're going to focus in the next couple of weeks on different types of models that are appropriate for different types of problems in some major categories. And it's important for us to realize at the outset here that what I'm not trying to get you to do is to memorize specific examples of models, but rather to understand the concept behind those models and hopefully to be able to build similar models for systems that you might encounter in your own work in the future. And a lot of the types of models that we're talking about will be very generally useful, not only for cells but for other systems that you might be studying. Now, an important aspect, this is a computational biology class, an important aspect here is that we need to be able to compute upon these models. We're not talking about conceptual models that just, for example, say, well, A influences B somehow, or we expect that cells are going to grow, but we don't have a description of how they're going to grow. We're talking about mathematical computational models, and part of what we're interested in doing there is to understand how we build those models and how we can compute upon those models, how we can compute those predictions that we've talked about. And there are a lot of tools for doing that, some of them very specialized, some of them more general, but what we're going to be focusing on here is on using general purpose tools where it will be more obvious what the contents of the model are, so that we can achieve this goal of having you understand how the models work from the inside out, rather than have some black box system that you just type a few things into and then the magic comes out. And so that's really the focus is going to be on using tools in a general way so that you understand what's going on inside of building the models. Now, that said, we're not going to go all the way to the level of, for example, having to have you guys directly integrate numerically integrate differential equations and things. We are going to talk about the principles behind it, but we're not expecting you to do that. So we are going to use some libraries and tools that help us with some of these aspects of the computation of mathematics. So with that said, we're going to start on the first topic within our modeling section, and that is a very simple but powerful kind of model, which is based around what's called a difference equation. So the idea here is that very often the kinds of models we want to build of biological systems have time as an essential component. That is, that what we're interested in is how does one biological system behave over time, especially when time may involve some change in conditions. The beginning of an infection, the addition of a drug, the beginning of differentiation, a mutation, whatever it might be. And so an important idea there is that this concept of time we're going to break down into viewing that as we know where things stand right now, and our model is going to try to tell us where they're going to be at some point in time later. Okay? And so that kind of dynamic model, we're going to start with a special case of in which we can say that the time frame we're interested in is such that time is happening in discrete steps, so that we have the state of the model right now, and then what we're going to be interested in is the state of the model at a specific time later, at a discrete specific step in time. And so an example of a model that meets that criterion is this one, which is a famous one that was described by Siegel. And the idea is this. Let's imagine we have some species of insects, and it hatches in the spring, flies around, crawls around, does whatever it's going to do during the summer, lays eggs, and then dies over the winter. What that means is that the insects exist in discrete generations. There aren't any children and parents alive at the same time. So time, therefore, from the perspective of a description of the insect population, happens in discrete steps. If we consider the total number of insects that are born in a particular year, that's a number that is fixed, or that we can just calculate or measure at a particular point in time. And then what we're going to be interested in then is what's the number going to be in the next generation. We're not going to be interested in if any of them die off during that time period or anything else. Just how many eggs hatched at the beginning of the period and then the next period. So that's this discrete time points. And so what we're going to say is that n sub I is the number of insects that are born in a particular year I. And if we look at that, what we can readily see is that the number of insects that are going to be in the next generation has to be somehow related to the number of insects in the previous generation. Obviously, if there are no insects in the first one, there are no insects in the next one. And so our idea then is that what we're going to do is we're going to say that the number of insects in the next generation is some kind of function. So mathematically, we're going to say it's some kind of function of the number in the previous generation. Now, with that type of equation, what we describe that as what's called a recursion relation. That is, the number in the next depends on the number in the previous. Okay? And when we have a recursion relation, if we're given the initial number and the function, then we can determine all the values to perfect accuracy for all subsequent generations. Okay? So let's consider a very simple case where the birth rate of the insects in the next generation is fixed. That is, there's a constant rate of births in the next generation as a function of how many insects there were in the previous generation. And so this capital R is going to be the ratio of the birth rate of the next to the previous. Okay, so that means that our function f of n sub I is just r times n sub I. Okay? The number in the next will just be some constant times the number in the previous. And of course, we can already start to begin to describe the behavior of the system as a function of the way we set the model up. That's part of our goal throughout the whole thing. We can say, well, if this r is less than 1, then n sub I is going to go to 0, of course. And if r is equal to 1, then n sub I, as I increases, is going to tend to stay the same. It's going to be, the birth rate's constant. And if the constant r is greater than 1, then of course the number of insects goes towards infinity. Okay? Well, obviously, the number of insects expanding until it hits infinity isn't very realistic. At some point, something is going to limit the growth of these, the number of insects that are born. So now we're going to make a more complicated version of the model. So what we're going to assume is that R, that ratio of the births from one generation to the next, is changing now with R. It's not a constant anymore. And we're going to assume that as n sub I approaches some limit, which is going to be k, that the growth rate is declining. Okay? So that what we can look at inside of here is that as n sub I approaches k, this number approaches 1, then this becomes 0, and the overall rate then becomes 0. Okay? Similarly, at the beginning, if n sub I is very small, this is approximately 0, and so the growth rate is going to be just r times 1 minus 0. And so that gives us an idea that the number of insects, if they start out small, the growth rate is high, that is r, and then as the number increases, the growth rate declines. Okay? With these two constants, r and k, both having to be positive. Okay, so then what that means is that we can rewrite our previous expression as this. Okay, so that ends of the number in the next generation is simply that new constant r times the number in the previous generation, times 1 minus how far we've gone towards the saturating value. Okay, so that's our new equation. It's still a recursion relation because it tells us next as a function of the previous one. And so now let's look at the behavior of that. Okay, so as we just described, of course, when we hit this, the birth rate is 0. If it's greater than that, the birth rate would be negative, so that's not allowed. So n sub I has to be bounded by k. All right? Now, here we have 3 variables, or 1 variable and 2 parameters. N sub I is a variable, and r and k are parameters of the system. We can simplify that by replacing n sub I, replacing k by defining a variable x sub I, which is just the fraction of the maximum that the insects are currently at. Right? So x sub I is just how far are we towards the maximum. And if we do this substitution for k, then what we end up with is this expression here. So you just take this and divide through by k, and you get this relation here. All right? So that has a single parameter, this r value, and is not dependent upon the absolute number of insects, just the relative number compared to the maximum number that are allowed. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to take that equation and build a model, a mathematical or a computational model. That's a mathematical model. Now we're going to build a computational model from that. And we're going to start with a very, very simple approach so that we can work our way up. And that is, we're just going to create that model in an Excel worksheet. Very, very simple. And we're going to, and then we're going to use that to build towards understanding the concepts we're going to use to build more complicated models and to use other tools. All right, so we're going to start with, we're going to build a spreadsheet. We'll do that in a second. But the idea is going to be that we're going to just create a spreadsheet in which, just like you might use one to calculate do your checkbook or whatever tools that you might want to use, we're going to use one cell to define this R parameter that we talked about. And then we're going to make a column that's going to contain the values of I, and another column that's going to contain the values of x of I, and we're going to initialize those for I equals 1 and x of I to be 0.1. So it's 10% of the maximum number of insects. Okay? Now, so we'll switch then to Excel, and what we're going to do now is to start creating, let me just expand this a little bit. All right, and so what we're going to do is, what we would like is to write a formula that allows us to calculate this index, this counter of the generation, and that's a very simple formula, which is that we just take the value of the previous cell and add 1 to it. Okay, so we can enter a formula into this cell that says take the value above it and add 1 to it. So then what we're going to do is we're going to enter a formula that allows us to calculate x sub I as a function of the previous x. Right? And we remember that that formula was the R value, B1 here, times the previous value, which is B4 times 1 minus B4. Okay? So that was our formula. X of I plus 1, R times X of I times quantity 1 minus X of I. Right? So that's our formula. Now if you look at that formula, what you notice is there's a dollar sign in front of the 1. The reason for that is that what we're going to do next is to copy these two formulas to further rows. And the way that spreadsheets work is that references to cells will automatically update as we copy. So as we copy down, the references, that this cell goes to this. If we copy to here, the formula when it was here would be referring to this cell. But we don't want the R value to change because it's always going to be here, so we put a dollar sign in front of it to force it to stay the same. Okay? So what that means is that with those two very simple formulas, we can just select this and copy it down to calculate the value of each of the different generations. All right? So we see how simple that was. We had a very simple formula, which was this recurrent relation. We write a formula to tell us what generation we're at, and then we write the formula to tell us how many insects we have. And so that means that we can then very easily select these cells and create a chart for them. Oops. So here we go. All right, so obviously the number of insects increases as the generation goes on in this case. Okay, so very simple tool, and what it means is that we can readily see what happens as we vary the R value. So for example, if we put in a value of R that's less than 1, then we see that the number of insects declines down to 0. Okay, so that's a very simple approach. And that's just captured in there. So we can copy down to create columns where we have multiple, to create multiple rows to represent each of the generations. We can also copy that whole thing over to the right such that we can change the R value and build a spreadsheet where we have multiple columns, one for each of the different values of R. Right? And that's shown here, and there's a spreadsheet on Blackboard that does that. But what we want to do now is to go beyond this. This would be very tedious to do. Excel's great for making a very simple model, so to illustrating it quickly, but that's not the kind of tool we're going to want to use to do this in practice. Okay, and so part of what we want to do now is to kind of introduce some of the concepts behind how we're going to use a scripting language that is MATLAB in order to be able to build models of these kind of systems. We're going to spend more time on Friday talking about the specifics of how we use MATLAB for these kind of things, but we're going to just start to introduce some of the concepts as we go. And one of the concepts we're going to introduce is the idea of a for loop. Most of you should know what a for loop is, but what we can think about it is that in this context, it's this process where we were sort of copying something down, copying a formula down and creating different rows that had different values for that formula. That was conceptually similar to just saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to calculate this thing as for different values of I, and that's the idea of a for loop. Okay, that is that a for loop is do this set of things for specific values of some variable. Okay, so if we look at that, what that would look like in MATLAB, that's shown here. So what we're going to do is very similar to the way we set up our spreadsheet. We're going to create our constants. In this case, the R value. We're going to set a variable equal to the value of R. And we're going to set up another variable, which is how many generations do we want to calculate the number of insects for. And we're going to set another variable for the initial number of insects, the initial fraction of insects. And then our for loop comes. Okay, so the idea here is that we're going to say, okay, for the value of I going from 1 to max I, which was defined up here, and by default, when we use this 1: syntax, what that means is increment from the first value to the last value by ones. Okay, so we say for each of the different values of I. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to create a vector that is indexed by I, and this vector is going to have the previous value of x, which is the value we set here. And then we're going to increment the value of x using our recursion relation. Okay? So we're going to save the previous value into this vector, and then we're going to increment the x value using our formula. And then the end just says, this is the end of the for loop. Do these things for I equals 1 to the maximum number of generations we want. Okay? So at the end of this for loop, it will do the calculation and create a vector. That vector will be of length max I, and we're going to then plot it. Now, just to notice, these values are variables, but this is a scalar variable. It's just a single value. But this guy is a vector. That is, it has the values of x for different values of I. Okay. So then our next part then is we're just going to plot it. By the way, in MATLAB, a % is a comment. And we terminate the lines with a semicolon, so that's what those things are there. So now this is just a comment saying, okay, plot the generations, and we're just going to use the plot command, and as the x variable of the plot, we're going to have the vector from 1 to max I, so that's just a vector of length max I, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And this vector that we made up here that contains the number of insects. And this just tells the plot command, plot it in black with symbols, with diamond symbols, and with a line connected to them. Don't worry about all that. As I said, we'll talk about that on Friday. All right. So we go ahead and we execute this, and we get a graph that shows the number of insects as a function of time, the fraction of insects as a number of time. Okay. So I'm going to now switch, and we're going to open up the code that we just looked at in MATLAB. And here it is. It's exactly what we just looked at. And if we type this in, we can just run the code by hitting run here, and it will pop up the plot. Okay. Now, this introduces one of the first simple things that we can do in this kind of model is we can just go in here, and we can, just like we did with the spreadsheet, we can type in a new value, and then hit run, and it will generate a new plot. In order to see the figure, we got to make it visible, and there's the plot for a different value of R. Okay? Now, as we talked about, we can do this changing the value of R one at a time and kind of write the values down or remember them or something. We can also, as we did with the spreadsheet, we can make different columns, one for each different value of R, and that introduces the idea of what we call nested for loops. Okay, so what we're going to have is essentially a for loop over I, and then that's going to be inside of another for loop, which is going to change the R value. All right. So how do we do that? What we're going to do is this part's going to stay basically the same. We're going to replace the constant value of r with a vector called range r, which is going to start at 0.2 and increment by 0.2 and go to 4. Okay, so instead of just one r value, we now have a bunch of r values in that vector. And we're going to make an initial for loop. It's called the outer for loop, where it says for r being chosen from each of the values in this vector, now do this stuff. Okay? And the thing that we're going to do is first initialize x to the value that we want, and then do the same loop that we had before, from I to 1 to max I, 1 to max I, calculate the vector, update the x, and then this for loop ends, and then we go and plot. Okay, so exactly the same. The only difference here is we're going to add in this pause thing, which just tells the system to stop until we tell it to continue, so that we can see the plot that was generated here for each of the values of r as we go along. All right, and there's a lot of other ways we could do that. And so this loop is called the inner loop, and then we have the outer loop. And of course, we can have as many of these different loops as we wanted to. All right? In this case, we're just dealing with 2. So this version of the code is that version that does the multiple steps, the multiple r values. And so we can run that. And what will happen is, now you can see we're getting a plot for r equals 0.2. And of course, that goes to 0. And then we can just keep hitting the enter key, and that will cancel the pause, and we'll go on to the next value of r. And we can watch the system change as the r value changes. Now, as the r value increases, the system still declines to 0, but it does so more slowly until we get to the point where the r value gets to 1 or higher than 1. And as it gets to 1 or higher than 1, what's going to happen is we're going to approach some steady state, okay, some plateau value. So you can see that happened here. So here's 1.2. We're approaching a value of around 0.17. When the growth rate goes higher, we get to an even higher level, 0.3. As the growth rate increases to 1, or the r value increases to 1.6, it gets a little bit higher and keeps on going up. And so we can look at each of these values. R equals 2, we go up to 0.5. And as r goes over 2, if you notice, something just happened there. In all the cases before this, the number of insects changed what's called monotonically from the initial value. If it was going to decline, it declined. If it was going to increase, it increased. But it did so without going up and down. It was only either going all up or all down. But in this case, as soon as we got a value of r greater than 2, notice that it overshot as it was climbing. It was going up monotonically, but then it overshot and then it came back down again. So the behavior just changed qualitatively from this monotonic behavior to what we would call an oscillatory behavior. That is where the value is, where it overshoots and then it corrects ourselves. And as r increases, that behavior gets more dramatic. Okay, so notice as we now here we are at 2.8, we have a fairly big overshoot and then an undershoot, and then we kind of iteratively work our way back. But we do eventually get to a plateau value, to a constant value. Now, as r keeps going, the speed with which it reaches that steady value is also going more slowly. It takes longer because it's overshooting by more and undershooting by more, and then that declines more gradually. But it is going to eventually get to that steady state value. But as we go over that, as we go over 3, what we notice is the system overshoots, and now it actually doesn't reach a steady state value at all. It just is oscillating continuously. And as we go higher, that behavior gets more dramatic, so it's getting even bigger. And then a very interesting thing happens, and as we get greater than the R value of 3.5, all of a sudden the system doesn't even have any apparent trend at all. It's still oscillating, but it's oscillating in a way where the value at the next generation isn't the limits of that are not continuously increasing or continuously decreasing. Sometimes it overshoots by more, sometimes by less. And as we continue, this behavior becomes even more obvious, and we've just made another qualitative change in behavior to what's called chaotic behavior. All right? So this behavior basically produces the number of insects in the next generation is, you can view it as almost random compared to the previous value. It's not actually random because it's directly predicted by this equation, but the behavior that you see there doesn't show any clean trend in terms of increasing or decreasing or any way that you could describe it, and that's called chaotic behavior. Okay? All right. So now what we want to do is to take the results that we've just looked at and think about how we can try to summarize that behavior in terms of a description of the model as we built it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a very simple approach, which is that we're going to use a line, a piece of a line. We're going to call it a parameter line, and we're going to mark out values, sort of like a number line when you were in grade school. We're going to mark out values, and between different values on that line, we're going to describe the behavior of the system. That is, between 0 and 1, the system was monotonic. Between 1 and 2, it was monotonic. In this case, it was monotonic and the insects were dying. In this case, they were monotonic and they were reaching a steady state. Then it started to become oscillatory, and then it became oscillatory and unstable, that is, chaotic. Okay? Now, we can construct a number line like this manually by just going through what we just did and then writing down notes and constructing the number line, and I may ask you to do that. But we can also actually build that kind of description automatically by looking at the final value of the system and then using that to, looking at the final value, looking at whether or not it's been bumping up and down, so whether it was monotonic or not, and we could actually have a computer generate that description if we wanted. One of the things we haven't considered so far is what are the values that the system stops at, depending on what the R value is. What's the value of X, this so-called final value of X? And both through the spreadsheet or through our MATLAB simulation, we could try to find out what this final value is and whether or not it's stable by looking to see, that if we keep copying down, we get, a final value. But that's kind of a very manual, approach. What we can do instead is we can try to find, mathematically, what these final values of the number of insects should be. In other words, we could just do so many iterations that we're expecting that it will probably reach its steady state value, and then we could look at what that value is. Or we could try to actually determine what the steady state value should be. And how do we do that? Well, the way we do that is we think about what it means to be a steady state value. A steady state value means that the number of insects in the next generation is the same as the number in the previous generation. Well, what that corresponds to is that x of I plus 1 is just equal to x of I. All right? And so that means we can just say that x of I is equal to the formula for x of I times r times 1 minus x sub I, right? So that this would be our normal relation here, and we just say, well, let's look for a value where x sub I is equal to x sub I plus 1, which means that we are left just simply with this, okay? So that equation, there are two solutions to that equation if you think about it for a second, right? What values of x is this statement true? Well, the first one obviously is that when x is 0, this statement is true, right? 0 equals 0. And that's the solution that we see when the R value is low. That's the final value we get to. What's the other solution of value, for x? It's here. You can convince yourself of that. You know, if you want to practice your algebra, you can find this value. But what we can see is that steady state value is going to be dependent upon R. Okay? So as R increases, this value gets smaller and smaller. Okay? So in other words, as R increases, we can get closer to this x value. But notice that as R gets really small, this value then starts to get, as R gets large, this value gets small, saying that it should be able to go to a steady state of close to 1, but in fact, as we've seen, it doesn't do that because as R gets larger, even though there would be a steady state at a value close to 1, the system can't get there. So those are two separate concepts. The idea, and we'll get to that in a second, the idea that we have a steady state, so these are two steady states that the system can reach, and the question is whether or not we actually get there. So, as we said, so which solution we get depends on both the value of R and potentially on the initial value. So obviously, for example, if x sub I is equal to 0, then we know we can't get to 1 minus 1 over R, even if the R value is favorable. The R value also then determines what the steady state value is because we know what kind of behavior we're going to have. So if the R value is less than 1, we're going to be approaching that 0 value. If it's between 1 and 2, we're going to be approaching that 1 over 1 minus R value. Okay? So that's the idea of the approach to the steady state. And we can mathematically determine which solution we would get by looking at the derivatives in the neighborhood of the steady state using, for example, a Taylor expansion. But we're not going to go into that. That is definitely mathematically a way that we can solve this. But we can also just numerically, computationally figure it out by just calculating the value at a large value of the number of generations, and then one more than that, and see whether or not we've reached the steady state as a very simple idea for determining whether we're approaching. Now, what that means is that we can now sort of update our parameter line to capture a lot of the behavior of the system, so that we can say between 0 and 1, if R is between 0 and 1, then we get monotonic behavior tending towards x equals 0. If it's between 1 and 2, we get monotonic again, but now tending towards 1 minus 1 over R. As we go greater than 2, then we get oscillatory behavior where we're bouncing up and down, but it still will want to get towards 1 minus 1 over R. And then as we get over 3, then we get oscillatory behavior, and it's unstable. So it's still oscillatory, but it's now unstable and doesn't get to a steady state value at any point. Okay? So what the parameter line does is it captures our qualitative understanding of the system as a function of the initial conditions and the parameter of the system, this R value. Okay? And so that's really what we're looking at, is we want to be able to take our model and then realize, okay, what are the parameters of this model? And once we know what those parameters are, how do we describe the behavior of the system as a function of the value of the one or more parameters. When we have one parameters, we can easily do that with a parameter line. And this is under the heading of trying to deal with or simplify a complex system, to reduce the complexity, so that we don't have to do a whole bunch, all of these, show a lot of graphs and whatever, that we can summarize the behavior qualitatively using something like this. And this is just one of the techniques. As we'll see, there are other approaches that we can use to try to summarize and simplify our analysis of a system. Now, one of the things that we get out of this is we notice that there are what we call transition values. The transition values are defined as values of the parameter, R in this case, where we have qualitatively, not just quantitatively, because obviously R is going to affect things quantitatively, but we have qualitatively different behavior. And so these transition values would be 1 in this case, where we make the transition between death and life, and 2, where we make the transition between monotonic and oscillatory, and 3, where we make the transition between oscillatory and unstable. Okay, so those are our transition values. To summarize then, we build these models. In this case, we have a simple model where change is happening discretely, so we can do individual calculations for each of the generations. And we can do the simulations either simply with Excel or with more complicated approaches, where we write a script to do it, or as we'll see later, other systems. And then we can use this kind of concept of a parameter line to summarize the behavior and to identify what the transition values are where the system is changing.